الو.
الو ماما.
عمر، وين صرت؟
واحدة من الجزر في اسكتلندا.
شاهد عمر شهر بالتسجيل في اسكتلندا. البابا عم يسأل إذا كان الوضع عندك مثل غوانتانا.
Limbo tells the story about a group of asylum seekers that are sent to a remote Scottish island to wait for their asylum claims. But it centers around Omar, who's a Syrian refugee and a talented musician, and it's about him coming to terms with his identity as a refugee. It came about, I mean, it's really something that goes back many years, and I think a kind of a combination of lots of different things. It kind of roots back, I think, to my about sort of 10 plus years ago. My undergraduate degree was in Arabic and politics, and as part of that, I spent my third year living in Syria, in Damascus. So I have this connection to Syria. And then, so following that, I mean, during the degree as well, I studied a lot around sort of the construction of the other and Orientalism, and that was really interesting for me. And then I went on to film school. I ended up working on a short film project and working with an NGO in the Sahrawi refugee camps in southern Algeria, and working specifically that was on a project to do with identity and how the label of being a refugee affects identity. And then I still had this sort of real interest and desire to try and tell a story, to make a film sort of about the broad subject of the refugee crisis. And I kind of found that that we had this sort of two sides of the narrative, where we had the demonizing of refugees that was dehumanizing, and we also had the pitying of refugees that was dehumanizing. And there weren't a lot of sort of representations of refugees that sort of humanize the refugee experience in a way that is perhaps more relatable, and really just looking at refugees as people like us. So that was the starting point to try and figure out, you know, how to do that, and how to tell a story about refugees and make a film about refugees with sort of my sensibility as a filmmaker as well, and with that kind of use of humor and drama. Specifically, I think that Limbo, you know, in all of the research that I did in the run up to making the film, this idea of limbo kept on coming up, and the experience of asylum seekers, you know, waiting, and you know, and this can go on for you know, for years. I don't know how it is in Belgium, but in the UK, you know, you can have people waiting for asylum. I spoke to someone who'd been waiting for asylum for 6 years, and with the status of an asylum seeker, you can't really do anything. You can't work, you can't integrate into society. You're really just stuck in this state of limbo. So it just felt like the sort of most kind of appropriate title that sums up what the film is about for these people.
Is he a tourist, Margaret?
You one of their refugees?
You speak English, pal?
Are you Muslim? We haven't got along.
No!
I always knew my previous film, Picadero, is also kind of a deadpan absurdist comedy, and mixes humor and drama, and this is kind of something that's very sort of integral to me as a filmmaker. So it started out by me wanting to make a film about the broad subject of the refugee crisis, and I knew that I wanted to use humor to do that, because that was kind of already sort of my sensibility and the way that I sort of see things and the way that I wanted to tell stories. And I think that kind of part of that is because it's sort of just in me, but part of it is because I also think that using humor can be this really useful tool to kind of access often political subject matter or serious subject matter in a different way. Again, it's sort of like there's two parts. That one part is that it's, you know, a lot of the time that's the way that I kind of see things when I'm writing, and when I'm writing, I'm kind of putting my vision into the screenplay as well, and it's kind of a part of my sensibility. But at the same time, I think the script writing and the filmmaking, they really go hand in hand, because this idea of these people being stuck in limbo and being in this sort of stasis, works perfectly to have a static camera. So that's really sort of embedded in the cinematic language of the film as well. I think two of the sort of main influences that kind of root back really to the point where I decided that I wanted to make films and be a filmmaker and go to film school was during my my degree in Arabic and politics, and in my final year I started to specialize in Middle Eastern cinema, and I came across the films of Elias Suleiman, Palestinian filmmaker, and I came across Aaron Collaren's film The Band's Visit. And I think seeing those films almost, back to back or in quite quick succession made me that's what made me want to be a filmmaker. So that they were sort of some of my root influences. And then also a lot of Iranian cinema, particularly in the kind of the use of metaphor and allegory. And then I would say some of the Scandinavian filmmakers, Roy Andersson is a really big one for me. Kaurismäki as well, a little bit, and then also Nuri Bilge Ceylan, the Turkish director, is a big influence too.
What instrument is that anyway?
Are you ever going to play that? Just like Karita wrote.
لك انت حتى ما عم تعزف على العود.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that kind of music is such a, it's so kind of connected to cinema. They're kind of art forms that feed into each other, and music feeds into cinema. I think, the oud itself and the use of the oud and that again was sort of looking at that from a metaphorical point of view. And I think that sort of, roots back to my kind of influence of Iranian cinema and the use of metaphor and allegory there, and that the oud really sort of started to embody Omar's identity and become a metaphor for Omar's identity, and it being, his grandfather's oud in the narrative, but it being something that's very specific to his culture and his identity, and even his, the garden of his family home being carved into the oud, and all of these things. So from that point of view, it kind of became the sort of part of creating this kind of metaphorical underlayer of Omar's own sort of struggle and journey with his identity and his circumstances as a refugee. It's kind of interesting. So for casting Amir as Omar, we started off with a very or quite a traditional casting process where we auditioned hundreds of people from all over the world, and initially I was also really quite interested in casting a Syrian in the role for Omar as well, and we couldn't quite find anyone that was quite right, and then I would sort of go back after the auditions or after kind of looking through the self-tapes and just kind of do loads of research and try and look at lots of different films and try and see if I could find something, and eventually I came across an image of Amir online, and I think I just knew immediately that he was our Omar. So I went, to bed that night dreaming of him in the role, and then we brought him in. We did initial self-tape with him, and he was just brilliant from that, thankfully. And then we brought him into the in-person auditions, and again, he was really great from the very beginning, and he kind of understood the character at quite a deep level from very early on.
يلا على ذكر صورة بشر. خلينا أهرب من العالم دقيقة واحدة.